Welcome to the League of Women Voters Lexington Community Forum, a Kentucky suffragist lesson. I am Mary Hughes, co-president of the League of Women Voters Lexington, and I am here tonight with my co-president, Jennifer Jackson. Tonight's speaker is Professor Melanie Beals Goan, who will discuss her newest book, A Simple Justice, Kentucky Women Fight for the Vote. Professor Goan is an associate professor of history at the University of Kentucky. She earned a BA in history at Slippery Rock University and an MA and PhD at the University of Kentucky. Her research and teaching focus are 20th century US history, Kentucky history, gender, and the history of healthcare. She is the author of Mary Breckinridge, the Frontier Nursing Service and Rural Health in Appalachia. We're excited to have Professor Goan with us tonight. We will have time at the end of Professor Goan's presentation for questions and answers. And now, Professor Goan.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone, for having me. And I know we have kind of a backstop tonight because President Biden is addressing the nation, and I imagine you all, of anyone, would be interested in that. So I'll try and keep things short, but also we want to have some time for questions. Let me go ahead and share my screen because I've got some slides here that I want to include. So I've titled the talk, Moving Beyond Susan and Elizabeth, and I imagine you can guess which Susan and which Elizabeth we're talking about here, and thinking about Kentucky suffrage. And let me start by saying that I was doing a lot of these talks last year. I thought I'd do a lot more of them in person. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. Boy, we had planned to celebrate big. There were marches and parades and memorials, all kinds of merriment that didn't happen. I guess we can't exactly blame the patriarchy for this one, but we have seen the one good outcome is all of the new suffrage scholarship that still came out. Quarantine couldn't stop it. And so all kinds of new books came out last year, 2020. These authors like me timed very carefully to try and get their book out right at this moment that we were celebrating, which, let me tell you, there's some pressure when you're writing a book that has to come out around the time of an anniversary. You just don't have any, you can't miss that date. And so a lot of pressure there. But these books providing new, deeper understanding of suffrage. And so my book, also coming out in 2020, I feel like I'm in very good company there. And I know some of you may have been listened to the talk on Tuesday. Dr. Du Bois was talking about national suffrage. So this should dovetail nicely with what she was discussing. So there's the cover of my book, which I really love this cover. UK Press did a great job, and I think it's really visually striking. And I'm so glad that they did put such effort into the design. My book is a study of Kentucky suffrage. Its big question is, what role did Kentucky play in this national movement? Why does Kentucky matter here? And Kentucky does very much matter, not only on the state level, but in the national suffrage story as well, which will hopefully become apparent tonight. Now, let me say something about the title, because titles are hard when you're writing a book, and there again, the press has a lot of input into a title. It's usually the last thing that is chosen, one of the last stages of a book project. And so this title, the press, with some negotiation, we came up with this one. And I really like it for a couple of reasons. I think it works on several levels. One, it gets at the heart of the matter. The idea that the vote for the women who are seeking it is a simple justice. It's a no-brainer. They feel like they deserve to be treated as full citizens who have a voice. They were tired of being grouped together with what were known at the time lunatics, children, groups that were disfranchised and not trusted with the vote. Women wanted a say in public matters. The second way, though, this title works is that it raises some important questions about the suffrage movement and some of its blind spots. And the question mark that shows up on the screen, I guess I revealed it a little too early. It's not on the actual book title, although in some ways it feels like it should be there, because suffragists who are arguing that the vote is a simple justice, in some cases, didn't always seem like they really believed that, at least not for everyone. They insisted that the vote was a fundamental right, but extending it to African American women especially, many balked at that idea. And race and gender here intersecting in some really important ways in this movement. It's going to be anything but simple. And Kentucky's experience, the way the movement plays out here in Kentucky very much shows that to be the case. It's a good reason. There's good reason why it took over 7 decades for women to win the right to vote. If it had been a simple movement, it wouldn't have lasted so long. So my title helping to think about some of the complications of the movement. So we'll start here, a little foundational knowledge, drawing on what you already know about suffrage. And over the last year or so, I think there has been a lot of discussion about suffrage. So maybe your knowledge has expanded in recent years. But I think there's a typical storyline here when Americans seem to recognize on some basic level that giving the right to vote to half of the nation's population was an important milestone, that they should know something about it. But what they know tends to be pretty limited, focused on a few people, a few events, kind of a textbook knowledge that Americans seem to have. And I'll call my husband, put him in the spotlight here for a second. And he's a wonderful, very wonderful, educated man. He has a PhD. I mean, smart guy. But when I started this process, he knew very little about suffrage, as most of us seem to. And so see if this sounds familiar, and you can nod your head as I'm doing this, if this sort of replicates your picture of suffrage that you have tucked away in your mind. So when I asked him, he said, oh, well, yeah, I know. It started at Seneca Falls, 1848. That's the kickoff event. And then you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. There's our Susan and Elizabeth. And they're going to lead a long fight. He said, I seem to remember it involved some marches, parades, because you had to convince all the men out there that the homes wouldn't completely fall apart if women went to vote. Then he remembered some women picketed the White House. And then 1920 comes and poof, women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And that's his version that was in his mind. And maybe that's what you remember about suffrage too. To his credit, he knows much more now that I've written this book, and he was a great support in the process. But I think it goes to show that we like neat, tidy narratives. We store away knowledge in simplified chunks. It's why when we think of the frontier, Daniel Boone, most of us think of, or Rosa Parks when we think of the civil rights movement. The reality is much more complicated. It involves a lot more people and a lot more events. Studying history has taught me that there's always a backstory, and that backstory probably has dozens of other backstories. Just like I was hearing about Ellen Battelle Dietrich and some of her backstory just now. Seneca Falls, we know, is not the first or even necessarily the most important suffrage event. And Lisa Tetraul, a historian, has told this story showing us how suffragists fought over how the movement would be remembered. And some won. Those who wrote the history became well remembered, and some others who were just as influential kind of slip into obscurity. Susan B. Anthony was not even at Seneca Falls. So some of our simplified memory here distorting a bit. The movement and the victory that comes finally is not nearly as sudden or complete as we like to think. This was actually a movement filled with limited victories, a lot of setbacks. Women win the right to vote in some cases to have it yanked away later. And the 19th Amendment doesn't enfranchise all women. We can see this map illustrates a lot of women had the right to vote pre-1920, and suffragists like to show this map here. They relied on a lot of maps to show the progress they were making. And so this is one that I think it's dated 1919. And if you look here, this map shows us a lot of important things. One, it shows that suffrage was not an all or nothing thing. It came in bits and pieces for a lot of women. And so if you look at the bottom there, the key, you see some cases women might have presidential suffrage or municipal suffrage. Maybe they could just vote in primaries, or they couldn't vote in primaries. So this patchwork all across the country. Now, you notice here, a lot of women in the West have the vote very early on compared to what we might suspect. So look there, you see Wyoming, Utah, another place, women were early adopters of the vote. Wyoming, the first territory. This explains why Jeanette Rankin is serving in the US House in the late 19 teens. Well before other women can even vote, she's holding office. And my students are always a little puzzled by this because she votes against US involvement in World War I. And they're like, how is there a woman? Women don't have the vote yet. Well, some women do. Montana women do, and they send Jeanette Rankin to the House. Also important to note, not all women are voting after 1920. And I think a really important figure here, 1940, only 3% of Southern African Americans can vote or are even registered to vote. So the Voting Rights Act going to be really important. Native American women, Asian women, even native-born women who marry foreign men in some cases after 1920, there are periods of time where even they cannot vote. So this is not happening just in one fell swoop. And another thing that gets obscured in a very simplified portrait like I just painted of suffrage is the disagreement that is part of the movement. These women, they may be fighting for the same goal, but they see very different ways to get there. Our memory suggests more agreement than there really was. Women were key anti-suffragists. So just because you were female didn't mean you necessarily wanted the vote. There's disagreement on tactics. And here I might say too, make a distinction between suffragists and suffragettes. And these are two terms that often get confused. Suffragists, that's how Kentucky women referred to themselves, the ones that are involved in the movement. They are adamant in calling themselves suffragists. They don't want to be associated with suffragettes because those were women with more radical ideas taken from the British movement, which even supported the destruction of property if it meant getting women's ideas enacted. And a lot of American women, Kentucky women, definitely say, we don't want to be associated with suffragettes. We probably shouldn't be surprised that bold, enterprising women here disagree about matters. They have a lot at stake here. So let me just say something about the Kentucky movement here. I think it's really valuable for us to push beyond knowing just a few names and a few events and to think about suffrage in the trenches, close to home here. Gives us a chance to think about how women's ideas are diverging. It gives us a chance to think about how expedience sometimes wins out over principles, and that's certainly happening in the American suffrage movement. It also allows us to consider how suffrage, a quintessential fight for democracy. I mean, we like to hold these women up as heroes, but actually, in some cases, we're seeing these undemocratic tendencies come out, exacerbating race divisions and class divisions. And so understanding the fight on a state and local level helps us to understand these tensions better. Kentucky has its own suffrage story, just as each state does. And Kentucky's, I will say, is, I think, a very important state to consider when we're thinking about what's happening even nationally. Now, I'm going to ask for a little participation here. If I say Kentucky suffrage, what names come to mind? What women are you familiar with, or figures? Because not everyone fighting for suffrage is a woman. Any names that stand out that you know well?
Laura Clay.
Okay. Yep, that's good. Laura Clay. A lot of people know Laura Clay's name. If you know any Kentucky suffrage, she's very likely the one you know. Any others that you sort of right away come to mind?
Madeline Breckinridge.
Okay, good. You picked the two that I thought you would pick right there. So look at me. I'm reading minds here. These are pretty obvious choices. If anyone's representing this movement, these two women have very long tenure. They're active. They're leading the Kentucky movement, and so we remember them well. And Laura Clay, we'll start with her there. Laura Clay, whoops, let me say a word about her. She is one of the Clay girls. That's how they were known. She had 3 sisters and a mother, all of them suffragists. She also had a father who was a bit of a cad and didn't treat her mother very well, which is why the Clay women get involved in this movement. She's not the granddaughter of Henry Clay. It's Cassius Clay, his line that she comes from. And she's going to play an essential role in the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. She helped to found it in the 1880s. She's going to be its president for over a quarter century. And so her name's synonymous with Kentucky suffrage. And then the other one that I thought you might say is Madeline Mcdowell Breckinridge. She comes onto the scene a little later. She's a little younger than Laura Clay, a part of a younger generation. She is connected to Henry Clay, although she doesn't have the name. She's Henry Clay's great-granddaughter, grew up in his house in Ashland. And she's the consummate progressive reformer. She suffered for tuberculosis, so that was one cause she was very active in juvenile courts and building playgrounds, you name it. If you look across Lexington, even today, you see her fingerprints all over the city. And she is going to be the one that leads the Kentucky suffrage movement across the finish line. So those are the two that we best remember. But the movement by 1920 numbered tens of thousands of people. And it didn't always start that way. Kentucky is slow to embrace suffrage, not as slow as some of its southern counterparts. But you can see here, it's a tough slog getting people to join the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. And so for many years, they hovered around 300 members. And one year they might add a few, but the next they would lose several. And so they never seemed to really get a lot of traction until the 19 teens. And the progressive movement is good for suffrage. A lot of women who have goals in mind, reform efforts that they are seeking, they begin to see the vote as a very important tool. So the movement growing there, especially 1913, 1914, 1915, that's when Madeline Mcdowell Breckinridge has taken over leadership, and suffrage becoming less radical in people's minds and more mainstream. So tens of thousands of Kentuckians here, many of them anonymous. Maybe we have their names. Rarely do we have their pictures, it seems. Very hard to track some of these women and men down. So we have CARA, I said, established in the 1880s. It's going to have local organizations, they call them local chapters, all over the state by 1920, but certain parts of the state are always going to be more active. One area is Lexington. It grows and provides a lot of the support base for the movement. Richmond also, Northern Kentucky, the other area, Covington and Kenton County, a lot of activity there pretty early on and throughout consistently. Those will be the mainstays. Louisville's really going to lag, doesn't have much suffrage support until about 1910, but then it starts to grow. And a lot of those numbers I just showed, the spectacular growth, a lot of that's coming from Louisville. Ashland had a really active group, Maysville. Oftentimes it depended on a certain leader. If you had a woman who was gung-ho like Maysville did, they could then rally the troops and get things going. But often just as easily, if a woman would move out of state, it could mean energy just dissipated. And that's what happens in a lot of communities. Some areas, it's just one or two people that are bravely signing on for suffrage. But the Kentucky Equal Rights Association is going to be quite remarkable. It's going to be the first organization of its kind in the South. Southern states, there's a lot of people that are hesitant to support votes for women. These areas tend to be more religious, more politically conservative. Then you have the race issue factoring in. So Southerners not necessarily naturally on board with this issue. At first, CARA is going to focus on issues beyond the vote. One of its biggest priorities early on is property rights for women. They're also interested in age of consent laws, which at the time the age of consent was 12, and they thought this was terrible, and men often were very badly behaved, and they want to change the sexual double standard that existed. They're also opening colleges to women, a variety of things that they're seeking beyond the vote. And one woman in particular who's influential in some of these early efforts is Josephine Henry. And no one mentioned her. Probably we should. She is helping set CARA's vision as much or even possibly more than Laura Clay. She is responsible for getting property rights passed. That's the thing we most associate with her. And she made no bones about this was unfair to women, that money they earned didn't go into their pockets. It was paid to their husbands, and property they brought into a marriage could be squandered. For instance, she told this one story, a woman in her own community who had been stripped of her assets. She had worked very hard. For 3 months, she had done sewing work to earn enough money to buy a cow. Probably going to help support her family with that cow. but her husband sold that cow right out from under her. The only concession, I'm quoting Henry here, the only concession the poor woman got was that he allowed her to milk the cow before they drove it away. Worse, Henry noted, the greedy husband traded the cow for a gun, filled up with whiskey, and started on the warpath. And so Josephine Henry really calling out the bad behavior of men. She is quite a spitfire. She's going to be the first woman in Kentucky to run for statewide office. She runs in 1890 for Kentucky's Court of Appeals. And she said she picked that office because it paid the best of any of them. You might as well go for big if you're going to run. Later, she was, as this clipping shows, she was mentioned as a candidate for president of the United States, running on the prohibition ticket. Now, some of her ideas are a little out there. She likes to push the envelope, and this clipping points that out. If you look down at the bottom there, one thing she's doing, she's assisting Elizabeth Cady Stanton in her Woman's Bible effort, and that was very controversial across the South. They're not rewriting the Bible per se, but pointing out scripture that ways that scripture has been manipulated. Later on, Henry's going to declare herself an atheist, and you can see here it mentions that she's an agnostic. She thinks Thanksgiving Day should be abolished. So a little cranky, to use a word that someone said at the time. She's going to get pushed out of the movement, and that's part of why we've not heard her name if she's not familiar to you. Her ouster is going to set Cara on a more conservative course. And Laura Clay especially wants to avoid anything that appears radical. She knew how controversial suffrage could be in a state like Kentucky. It doesn't play well in the Bible Belt. And she wants suffrage to be palatable to the widest variety of white women. And so she's big on quoting scripture. Cara meetings start with a prayer and hymns are interspersed. Laura Clay is not interested in working with labor unions when some of those alliances are forming in the 19-teens. When parades become a big thing, she has her doubts about that. She thinks it's unseemly for women to be marching. So Laura Clay, pretty conventional in her views. And most important to Laura Clay is separating suffrage from race equality. And again, she makes this out to be a practical issue that Kentucky women won't go for it, Southern women won't go for it. And to a certain extent, it's a legitimate concern in an era where the lines of segregation are hardening. To link suffrage in any way to race equality is going to be problematic. Now, Laura Clay, I think, takes it further than certainly she needed to, and her claims that this is just an issue of practicality, I don't believe that. And it's a bit ironic because Laura Clay, the daughter of Cassius Clay, a noted abolitionist here, who's standing up for justice, is going against the grain in some ways, is not willing to go against the grain in this way. She keeps Cara an all-white organization throughout its entire history. It's not even like separate Black chapters are being established. Cara will never officially reach across the race lines. Individual women do in some cases, but Laura Clay is never endorsing that from a state perspective. There won't be separate Black organization in Kentucky. And Laura Clay, her rhetoric here, I mean, it's shocking to today's sensibilities. because she's arguing very blatantly that enfranchising women, white women, is the way to solve the South's problem, that you have Black men voting and white women will offset them, and taking this issue and arguing that enfranchising white women will protect white supremacy. And she uses exactly those words, white supremacy. This is not like something she's dancing around, trying to sugarcoat. She uses those exact words. So this movement here, not one that in Kentucky, at least, that is viewing the vote as something that should be available to all women. Now, we will have Black women in Kentucky who are suffragists, no doubt about that. And here we have a good example of that. We have Mary Ellen Britton, very famously. She gave the first suffrage talk in Kentucky, long before Laura Clay is out there advocating. In 1887, she is speaking to a group, a mixed audience of African Americans. It's a meeting of teachers, and she gives a very passionate defense of why women should have the vote. Mary Ellen Britton was well educated, went to Berea College. She's a teacher at first. She becomes a medical doctor later, a dedicated race woman. Now, Mary Ellen Britton is not going to be out there on the front lines arguing specifically for the vote. Although, like many African Americans, when it happens in 1920, and Kentucky had never officially disfranchised Black men, so Black women are going to vote in large numbers in 1920. And here you see them registering to vote. Black women want the vote, but what I found in my research is they had a lot of other issues and problems they wanted to solve first. And the vote that's a long range issue when you are facing problems like lynching and segregation of the trains and economic injustice. And so they're looking at some of the immediate problems and preferencing that over dedicated suffrage work. They don't have the luxury of putting all their attention on one issue like the vote, but again, using the vote when it is an option. So suffrage is a tough sell in the South for several reasons, most notably the race issue. But that's part of why Kentucky was so important. National leaders looked to Kentucky as an entering wedge, a door opening to the rest of the South. After the Civil War, they want to break into this new market. They want to attract Southerners to the cause, and Kentucky has great promise in their mind. For one thing, the Clay women and the name recognition that comes with having the Clay name, that's a big incentive to them, and they're going to really court the Clay women. Another reason these national leaders are attracted to Kentucky is that some Kentucky women had been among the earliest in the nation to vote. 1838, Kentucky gave a small number of women. They were either widows, single women, they had to be taxpayers. They got the right to vote in a particular kind of election. Anyone want to guess what kind of election they're allowed to participate in? Mary, you want to take a guess? Just take a wild stab.
Well, Benita says school board elections.
Oh, okay, Benita, you got it. Yep. Good job. Yeah, women, they are the caretakers of children. They have children's best interest at heart. Kentucky women didn't even seem to, I have found no evidence that they were actually seeking this right. And so it's a little surprising that the legislature made this move. I think it's because of taxpayer rights and less about gender. But national leaders looked at that and said, look at these enlightened Kentuckians who've given women the right to vote. They call it one little star of light, and Kentucky becoming something of a model for the nation. Now, our legislature is also going to yank that right away from Kentucky women after 1902. And so how enlightened they are, I think, is really up for debate. But for national leaders, this was important. And there too, if you're looking at tapping into the South, Kentucky as a border state, more moderate in some of its views, including its race views, than the Deep South. Clay is going to become one of the most famous suffragists in the nation. She was well known, particularly in the South. There's one other Southern suffragist who may have had as much name recognition as she did, but Laura Clay is very notable. And she's also going to help move the National away from some of its more democratic objectives. She's a national officer, and here you see this picture. It's not the best image, but such a wonderful, candid shot here of suffrage leaders. And see if you can recognize any of these women. If you look at the faces there, Laura Clay, I'm not sure, can you see my cursor? Okay, so Laura Clay is standing here, and standing down below her, sort of always in a position of being revered, is Susan B. Anthony. Then we have, if I move it over a little, you see that face? That may be one you recognize. Anna Howard Shaw is there. And then this one looking down, that's Carrie Chapman Catt. So some really influential women here. Laura Clay is part of this group. I mean, she's in their ranks. They referred to Aunt Susan's girls, and she was one of them. So influential position she's in, but she's also a very controversial figure. Laura Clay believes very strongly in her principles, and that's going to put her at odds with her colleagues, especially as we move closer to 1920. She wants women's suffrage. She wants women to vote, no doubt, but she felt that it must come one way and one way only, and it must come through state constitutional amendments. And especially once a federal amendment becomes, it seems like it might actually happen, Laura Clay is adamantly opposed to a federal amendment. And others don't agree with her. 1916, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, the mainstream national suffrage organization led by Carrie Chapman Catt, they are going to put their sights on a federal amendment. Even Woodrow Wilson comes out in favor of an amendment after 1916, and he's a Southerner. Laura Clay, no way, no how is she having any part of it. She feels that a federal amendment is going to lead America down the path of destruction. Just look at what the 15th Amendment had done. And the 19th Amendment copied its language exactly. And Laura Clay, as a states' rights suffragist, sees this as just impossible. In the end, Clay's going to break with the movement, break with her colleagues and her dear friends, shocking a lot of people. You can see here the headlines. Laura Clay leaves the suffrage forces. My book, that's where it starts. And I do appreciate that Laura Clay gave me a really great opening and a way to build some suspense as she goes to Tennessee to fight to defeat the 19th Amendment. I hope you'll maybe read about it in my book. Much to Clay's chagrin, Kentucky is going to ratify the 19th Amendment. A lot of her CARA colleagues don't see the matter the same way she does. And Kentucky is going to become the 24th state to ratify in January of 1920. This famous image here, women standing around as Governor Morrow signs that document. Largely, that's going to be due to Louisville women's activities, Madeline McDowell, Breckinridge's leadership. Laura Clay is not in this picture here. She would have nothing to do with the 19th Amendment, although she would vote in the fall of 1920. She would use the rights it provided her, but she remaining insistent that the 19th Amendment was the wrong action. So the vote here, we see it as an important victory, but the story of how it was won doesn't always reflect our best selves. We certainly could say that about Clay's actions. It's no way simple, as my title suggests, in many ways, a continued betrayal of justice. And many people have worked over the past year to not just celebrate suffrage, to commemorate it. And that involves understanding some of its blind spots. Racism, class division, self-interest here, part of the story, because after all, it is a human story. And that makes it important for us, filled with lessons that we can use today. It reminds us that democracy is a continuous process. We have to be continually moving the arc of justice forward. The fight's not over, and we're seeing that absolutely today and this year, and the decisions that are being made on state and national levels. And I know you, as members of the League of Women Voters, understand that. The work you are doing is incredibly important and needed more even today than it may have been in previous years. So I'll turn it over there. I'm not sure how long I've gone. Okay. Hopefully I didn't drone on too long there.
Yeah. You did well.
I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, so actually we have some questions in the chat box, or some comments. So Benita mentions that up here in Kenton County, our own Ellen Battelle Diedrich was the founding vice president of CARA in 1888.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Joetta has a question. So she says that she has heard the term suffragette was used by the media to put down activists by using the diminutive "et" terminology. Is that true?
Yeah, and that, though, is going back to the British movement again, because when the term is used in the United States, in some cases, women are eagerly embracing that term. Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party, they're not going so far as their British counterparts to destroy property, but they are, in a very public way, calling out America, calling into question its ideals in a period of war. Their actions seen as more radical, and so they accept that title of suffragette because it does tie them to a more militant movement overseas. Kentucky women, though, they say, do not call us that. There is not a single suffragette in Kentucky, Laura Clay says. So the idea is sort of shocking to her that they would be thought of in that way.
So, and then regarding Laura Clay, so Joetta also knows that she's referred to as Miss Clay, and was wondering if she continued to be single her entire life.
Yeah, she never married. That's the reason that she, I would say, is the most influential of the Clay sisters. They're all very talented. And I noticed someone mentioned Mary Barclay in the comments. That's her older sister. She's the oldest of the
Oh,
girls.
okay.
And she's really the one that is getting the ball rolling in Kentucky, because she starts writing to suffrage periodicals in the 1870s. She gets a divorce from her husband around that time. She starts attending national meetings, and national leaders try to get their hooks into her. And Laura Clay at first really is not as interested. She's sort of staying on the sidelines. But then Mary Bar Clay had 3 sons. She's a busy girl. She has lots of stuff going on. Can't really give the movement, I would say, the leadership it needed. And Laura Clay, who doesn't marry, makes suffrage work her life's career.
So another question about Laura Clay. What was Laura Clay's rationale for why suffrage needed to be a state by state approval versus a federal?
Her real reason or her stated reason?
We want to know both.
Yeah. I mean, I think her real reason is because Black women will get the right to vote. She's afraid if states can't control their own affairs. I mean, because let's face it, states' rights is coming down to race. This is not, some like flippant issue that states want to control. They want to control their ability to keep Blacks in an inferior position. And so Laura Clay, now in Kentucky, this issue is maybe not quite as pressing as it is throughout the South, the Deep South. But Laura Clay, this is how she has built her fame in the movement. It's her platform to be a representative of Southern women. And for that reason, she's defending some of these Deep South principles that are maybe a little more vigorous than the resistance we see in Kentucky. Now, what she says is she wants it to be a state by state issue because she just can't bear the thought that it wouldn't be the men of Kentucky that grant this right to them. She doesn't want it coming from some other men, some other place. She wants fathers and brothers and the men in her own life to recognize her worth and bestow this right upon her. But I think there's an ulterior motive there for sure too.
We have a comment from Becky Jones, as Ellen Dietrich in Kenton County, again, was also a contributing author to Stanton's Women's Bible, and her father was a Methodist pastor and abolitionist.
Yeah. Once she leaves Kentucky, and she is only here for just several years, right around 1890, she's gone soon after that. And so I didn't follow her much after that. But I have a feeling that had she remained in Kentucky, she would have been much more influential. And she and Josephine Henry, I think, still have ties even after Dietrich has left. And so the ideas there, they share some similar perspectives. So she might have gotten pushed out of the movement too, for all I know.
And I think we've already answered this about how Mary Bar Clay is related to Laura.
Yeah.
Cindy has another question. Would you talk about the difference in strategy closer to passage of the amendment between the more militant picket at the White House versus the more let's work together with the men to get this done?
Yeah. Plenty of suffragists realized that World War I is this auspicious moment for suffrage. It could be the thing that gets them across the finish line, but it could also really set them back. And so they're really careful on how they use World War I and their involvement, and whether they're going to put their suffrage work on hold and go gung-ho, patriotic in working toward war aims, or if they're going to try and leverage the war and keep doing what they're doing. And the two groups that are considering this issue and taking a different route, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the more mainstream national organization, and then the more radical National Women's Party. Alice Paul, National Women's Party, says we got to milk this war for all it's worth. We're not going to put anything on hold. Whereas Carrie Chapman Catt's leading NASA to make the war their primary aim. And I think it's because we have these two different approaches, really, that suffrage happens then at the end of the war. You needed those militants pushing, but having the NASA and their dedication to their country, that gives them a lot of brownie points. And the two approaches working together seem to really be what do the trick. But yeah, the National Women's Party, they're sending those silent sentinels every day. They're standing outside the White House. They're holding up signs, Kaiser Wilson, look at how hypocritical American leaders are, because this isn't a war to make the world safe for democracy if women aren't included.
Becky Jones is asking, did you find disagreement on policies among members of the of CARA?
Yeah, I think because Laura Clay had such a tight hold on things, and the Laura Clay collection, her papers at UK are our best suffrage sources, and she's writing and editing CARA publications. So a lot of that controversy isn't making it into the record necessarily, although we see some examples of that. And the best one when Josephine Henry is being pushed out, and the words they exchange for being such close friends, they're not going to speak ever again. They would find out information about each other from other friends and colleagues, but they broke ties. And Laura Clay, she really maneuvers to make sure Josephine Henry will not be reelected to a leadership role in CARA. And so that's one example, and that's over religion and the differing perspective there on scripture. They see the Bible in very different ways.
And I just had a quick question. You had mentioned that after 1940, only 3% of Southern Blacks were registered to vote. Was that Southern Black women or all, like?
That's total.
Total.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I have some better numbers on that. I can't remember off the top of my head. But I think it's 2% were registered, which is a big change from the 1870s, where I know I heard Henry Louis Gates speak the other day, and he gave some specific numbers of the Black men throughout the South who were voting in the 1870s. And then by 1900, I think it's like 2% of African Americans are registered. And when women get the right to vote, that number only goes up to 3%. So very few Black women. Kentucky's a little bit of an exception. We remained a two-party state. We never officially disfranchised African Americans, and Black women are definitely voting and eagerly doing so.
All right, so now we have questions about how we can best obtain your book, and then also, if we purchase a book, will you be able to autograph our books for us?
Yeah, I would be glad. There's a bug flying around me. I would be glad to do that. I haven't gotten to do much of that kind of, going out there and signing books or anything. UK Press, you can buy it through UK Press. It's also available on Amazon. And I think Joseph Beth has copies too. And I'm trying to think of how we could do it, because I would love to sign it. That'd be great. Do you all envision meeting in person down the line? Well, at some point, I know you do.
Eventually.
Do you have any sort of hints of when that might happen?
Yeah, we might be, I'm not sure, but we might be able to figure out a plan for like coordinating like a bulk purchase or something from Joseph Beth, and then, bringing them to you and having you autograph them and then be able to distribute them.
Another thing I have done, KHS, the Kentucky Historical Society, had me sign some book plates, and then they were just like stickers you stuck in once
Oh,
you
okay.
got a copy of a book. So, and maybe we could just do book plates like that. And I'm local, so it's easy for me to drop them off, or, you could drop
Right.
them off to me, or we can ship them.
That sounds wonderful. Great. Thanks so much for doing this wonderful presentation. And I know I'm looking forward to reading your book, which I do have. And I'm sure there's others in our audience, as we could see from the chat. And there will be a recording of this forum available in a few days on our website and also on Outreach Circle. And I just wanted to say a little bit about what's happening next month. Please join us on Tuesday, April 13th from 7 to 8:30 p.m., also on Zoom, for our women's panel, The State of Kentucky Women Today, Action Plans for the Future. This forum will be moderated by Renee Shaw of KET, and we will have 5 outstanding panelists in the area of health advocacy, education, government, and business. And you can find more information on the forum on our website or on Outreach Circle. And thank you, Professor Goan, for being here tonight, and for everybody else. It was great fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Have
And
a
I
good
dropped
night,
a link for Outreach Circle in the chat box in case anybody needs that. And you can just download the app from the App Store or the Play Store. And then you can just search for League of Women Voters of Lexington or put in the shortcut DUV 861.
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.
You, good night.